Hello there, and welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast series, brought to you by Rethink Dyslexia, the podcast where we're breaking barriers and doing things differently. I'm Shay Wissell, your host, and I'm so glad you can join us. I'm a fellow neurodivergent, and I'm coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I live and work. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all the tribes across our beautiful country and to all First Nations people listening today. Our podcast was born in 2017 out of a need to give a voice to the stories and perspectives of adults with dyslexia. And our voice has grown stronger year after year. We're now a globally listened to podcast with guests from all around the world. Join us for insightful conversations about living with dyslexia and other neurodivergences across all walks of life. Our special focus is on adult education, employment, social and emotional wellbeing, and entrepreneurship. We're excited to be bringing you this episode and invite you to like and follow us, or even better, why not leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. So let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dear Dyslexic podcast show. Today, I'm lucky enough to speak to Peter, who's from the Centre for Disability Employment, Research and Practice, which I had to make sure I had on my screen so that I didn't mix up all the words, because that is a big title for a dyslexic to say. So welcome to the show, Peter.
Great, thanks, Shay. And for your own benefit, we abbreviate it to CDERP, CDERP, because, yes, it is long.
I should have asked you that beforehand.
Well, something I learned years ago, one of my previous counselling services, I came up with a fabulous name that I loved, and then I stupidly decided to use it as my email address, and people would ring me all the time and go, your email address is too long. And I went, yes, I know. So a lesson learnt there for people that struggle with words and letters and things like that. So that's why we keep it short.
Yes, my email address is way too long. I do need to change it. I've been meaning to ask the IT person to change mine. But thank you for being on the show, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk at your upcoming conference on disability employment. And I thought today would be a good opportunity to talk about the work that you do and maybe where disability sits at the moment with so many changes we're seeing come through NDIS and just in general with the new neurodivergent movement, which isn't really new but is very public now. And so it's a great chance to talk to you. But for our listeners who may not have met you before or know much about, now I can't remember the acronym, know much about where you work and research, could you please tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Peter Smith, and I'm the Director and Founder of the Centre for Disability Employment Research and Practice, or CDERP for short. And CDERP consists these days, we've been running for about 15 years, and the centre was founded as an outcome of some of the work that I was doing when I was at Sydney University. In those days, the university didn't have a great deal of focus on disability and employment, and with the NDIS coming along, they still didn't have much interest in it. And of course, at that stage, I was working in the US with Carrie Griffin, who's one of the pioneers behind customised employment in the US. And of course, I kept coming back to Australia and going, we need to do something. And my mentor at the university, who's still my mentor today, is Emeritus Professor Trevor Parmenter, who was the Chair of Disability at Sydney Medical School and also the head of the Centre for Disability Studies at the University of Sydney. And of course, Trevor kept saying, just wait. And of course, that wait went through a master's degree and then into a doctoral program. And I was overseas at Carrie's place one mid-year. And he just said to me, you're going to have to go back to Australia and do this yourself. And I went, yes, I know. So myself and two or three of my friends, we informally started the centre about 15 years ago, and we were focused on research and training using the tools that Carrie gave us. And over the years, we've conducted research. We formalised the centre about 12 years ago, and specifically to focus on developing the evidence base for disability employment and also training people in evidence-based methodologies with an emphasis on customised employment. So that's where we started all those years ago, and here we are today in the next stage of our growth. Our CDERP College, which is our training platform, developed and had accredited training with the accrediting body in the US. So we have the only accredited customised employment training program outside of the US. It's specifically written for Australia in the NDIS. We have our employment program, Work First, which again started as a small entity and still is a modest entity by employment standards, but it's where we actually use the methodology and also allows us to get feedback and refine the methodology firsthand rather than sitting in a lab somewhere waiting for someone to say, look, this is what's happening. It's like, well, we see it every day. The other side of it, of course, is our research. And we've just recently established a not-for-profit, which is where our research now resides. And the logic behind that is that it opens us up to more opportunities to attract funding for our research, which is a problem in Australia. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I used to spend most of my life travelling and being overseas, but COVID put a stop to that, which is good because honestly, after 20 years of travel, it's nice to be at home. So that's a little bit about me. We're Melbourne-based, but of course we have people that work with us all over Australia, and we support people currently in Australia, New Zealand, and in Asia, and actually in Saudi Arabia as well. So we're a little global, but we're still focused at home.
And that's why one of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you, because I guess we're a replica of you, but in the neurodivergent space, and everything we do is around what the evidence base is that we've created, particularly with dyslexic individuals. And we are in the process, and I don't know what our chances are, but my charity is turning into a research centre, so we can do exactly what you're doing. So it's exciting to learn and understand the landscape more, because I think when I started, I didn't see it as disability employment or disability support. It was just helping dyslexic adults like myself. And it's grown to be really shaped by disability and disability policy and what's happening at the moment, both in Australia and globally. And so it's exciting to talk to other organisations that are much bigger than us. Even though we have a global footprint, it's very tiny, but who we can kind of learn from, really.
I think you'll find that most organisations that are at the forefront of what we do are actually small, but they have global footprints, and that's simply because, the people that are making the changes are all over the world, and they like to work with people that are doing the same things they're doing, so we can share our resources and share our knowledge base and have greater impact. I mean, I work with people at a number of centres in the US, UMass, Utah University, Cornell University, where I was based prior to COVID, and a number of other institutions. So we're not limited as individuals anymore and organisations, because the world truly is global when it comes to research. The irony, of course, is that we have more collaborations overseas than we do in Australia. So I always find that quite funny. But at the same time, it just means that we end up working with and successfully working with building a network of people like yourself who are focused on individual aspects of disability. And dyslexia is a fascinating one, because I've never looked deeply into dyslexia, despite the fact that I have a brother with dyslexia. So you can imagine 60-something years of my younger brother with dyslexia, and to be brutally honest with you, most of us in the family, which is kind of myself and maybe my other brothers, never really thought about it, because guess what? That's just Scott. That's who he is. So I think it points to something a little bit, from my point of view, is that it does say that disability is every day. It's everywhere. Most of us have it in our lives. Most of us just accept it as part of the person. It's the other aspects of society that make it a challenge.
Yes, and I think for dyslexics, I don't know if we've always felt like we're part of the disability community, because the environment disables us, and that's why I shared that paper with you that's just been published, trying to gain a better understanding. I think when I started, that's why I didn't think I'd be working the disability space. So it's been interesting over the last 8 years to kind of unpack it and to see where it really fits in society, because a lot of times people wouldn't say that we're disabled because we have trouble reading and writing. If you see me getting a doctorate, you wouldn't think that my reading and writing is disabling enough for me to get a doctorate, but I have a lot of support to be able to do that. So I think it's that understanding of what those differences mean and how we're supporting individuals, and that it is just them, but they still need some support.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was born with a neurological condition, and I've never really thought of it much in the sense that, is this something I should say, oh, look, I have a disability? No, I never have, because, it's just who I am. It's probably a bit like my brother's dyslexia. It's just who we are. It's not something that we've made much of. But, sometimes, to be honest with you, even with the disabilities I've acquired, I still struggle with the notion of saying, oh, look, I need that because I'm disabled. And I think maybe that speaks more about me than anything else, or maybe my upbringing. But I think it's interesting that when it comes to disability, in order to get supports, you've got to prove you're disabled. And yet those supports are there to enable you to live a life like everybody else. So there seems to be this contradiction between we want you to be like everybody else and have a normal life and access the same thing everybody else has. But by the way, in order to do that, can you prove that you're really disabled? I mean, it's probably one of the paradoxes for me is if you look at disability employment services in Australia, the mainstream workforce program, about half of its clients are people with psychiatric disability, mental illness, of some varying forms. And then you go and look at the disability employment service, exactly the same profile. Half of its clients are people with psychiatric or psychosocial disability. So it's quite an interesting thing that we have all these programs that supposedly for different cohorts, and yet they actually service all the same people. I mean, probably where it gets different is with the NDIS, which I think is probably the better of all of the programs because it actually provides the right sort of supports, those individual supports. And it's been fascinating to watch all the toings and goings over the last probably year or so where the minister was trying to change the legislation and do all this sort of stuff. But, one of the interesting things is that I did a review of legislation, disability employment legislation in selected countries, which was published in 2023. And the thing to note is that the legislations we have are fine. Much the change that Bill Shorten brought in was simply about making more explicit what was implied in the legislation. It really didn't change anything other than go, you know what, we just got to make it more explicit for people. Where disability and support in many programs falls down is we have generally pretty ordinary policy. The application of that policy and its interpretation is pretty poor. If you look at support coordination and LAC and the NDIS, there's such a divergent views amongst people. You can have people in the same office with different opinions of what they can and can't do. So that the failing isn't so much in the legislation, it's more on the application of everything under the legislation.
And do you think part of it also is like you don't resonate with the label disability? A lot of dyslexic people don't kind of resonate with it in different environments. Society doesn't really see a lot of the hidden disabilities as disability because culturally we've been told that disability looks a certain way. So do you think that part of it is a social context around the labelling and the language that then impacts on policy and understanding policy?
Well, I think so because, most people's understanding or experience of disability is what they can see, and the large portion of disability is invisible. So most people, when they talk about disability or their experience, when they say, oh, yes, I've seen people with disability, see them all the time, what are they talking about? They're probably talking about someone with Down syndrome, someone with cerebral palsy, and someone in a wheelchair or some sort of mobility issues. The obvious disability, which is not to say that's an issue or anything. It just simply says that for most people, they're visual, and if they can't see it, it doesn't exist. So when it comes to the bulk of disability, it's largely invisible. I mean, autism is probably a very good example. I've got 5 family members on the spectrum, and I defy anybody to stand there and look at them all and go, tell me which one he is. There isn't, because that's just nonsense. I spent a couple of years researching and studying autism at uni, and, are the signs there? Maybe they're very subtle, but I would suggest that most people in the general public who are untrained couldn't pick it. And why should they? Because at the end of the day, if you have a disability, that's for you. That's for you in the sense that it is your disability and not the public's disability.
So I guess there's 2 questions. One's around lived experience. But the first one is, how did you end up working in this space? Was it because of your studies in autism or?
No, it was actually in my 40s. After a string of heart attacks, I kind of upended everybody and we moved back to the Northern Rivers so my kids, who were quite young at that stage, could actually have family around them. And strangely enough, my brothers elected me to go and work in the family businesses, which was like, okay, I drew the short straw. But, during that period, I started thinking to myself, you know what, I want to go back to school and do what I want to do, what I've always wanted to do. I've had a business career and that's fine. So I went back to school to study applied psychology, and I moved to Brisbane. One of my daughters was studying, so my wife sort of moved her career to Brisbane, which she could do. And I went back to school and studied, and oddly enough, and most people find this kind of weird, I went and worked in a petrol station up doing night shift so I could study during the day. And oddly enough, what you find is most people in a garage of a night time doing night shift are people studying. It's quite funny. There's a cohort of students working by night and studying by day. But it was during that period that I decided that I needed to work in my field. And I went to work for Uniting Care, and they put me in their disability service, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But they did say to me that if you love it, you'll never leave. If you don't, you'll be gone in 3 months, 25 years ago. And what happened, of course, is during that period, I met a great guy at Sydney University, one of the lecturers who was running a program, Russell Shuttleworth, who's at Deakin in Geelong these days. And I had this philosophy where every time I had a question, I'd go and look for the answer. And that's how I got to study at Sydney University, was that we had clients in direct support that wanted to work, and Uniting Care bosses would say, well, we don't do that. You can do that in your own time. And that led me to study, and it was working with Russell at Sydney Uni that he said to me that when you've got a question, enroll in a degree. At least you get a reward for your effort. And I kind of went, interesting. Well, several degrees later, little did I know the pathway it put me on. And it was just from working in direct support that I ended up in disability employment in the early days of it, before it became the DES system. When it just went from there. And when I started doing my PhD, which is over a decade ago now, it didn't take me long to realise that I couldn't work full-time and do a PhD. So I was actually, in those days, I was working for Disability Employment Australia, one of the peak bodies, and I ended up, oddly enough, going to work with the Centre for Disability Studies as a consultant and doing work with them, and it kind of just went from there. Because what used to happen, Shay, and this is kind of strange, and I think everybody should have someone like this in their life, Trevor would ring me up and he'd say, do you know this person? And I'd go, no. And he said, you should. And he would never say why. And that's how I found myself working in Vermont and all sorts of places. And it was that same inquiry that led me to ring Carrie Griffin up one day and kind of go, okay, you do this, can you tell me more about it? And he just said, come to America. You're invited to my place. And it kind of all went from there. I got drawn into it like a spider web. But, it was really about learning. And I think the key thing I picked up is that you never know everything and you never stop learning. And that's the constant.
I think especially in this constant changing environment we're in.
Oh, yeah.
You can't stop learning, can you?
No.
My brain was going multiple ways when you were sharing that story because I had lots of things to ask. One, I think I needed Trevor in my life.
Well, everybody does. I mean, Trevor's, 92 now and he's still working. I think that everybody in our field should have a mentor, someone they can fall back on that will guide them, that will give them some of the history. I've just finished writing a book chapter for Palgrave, Encyclopedia on Intellectual Disability, and I've written a chapter on disability employment methodology. And it was a great lesson because I ended up reading papers that I hadn't read in ages, papers that I hadn't seen before, and it filled out my knowledge a little bit more and highlighted things that I thought, I never knew that. And there were things that I think I need to work on that to fix that. But you need that sort of stuff. I don't think you can do this work by just staying immersed in what you do in a narrow field. I mean, the field of disability and employment is so broad that you really need to have that ongoing exposure to a range of different areas. And I think this is, when you talk about dyslexia, your area of expertise, I'll bet it's probably one of the most misunderstood areas when you're dealing with people in the NDIS. I think you'd struggle to find someone that really understands it.
Well, we're not even covered under the NDIS.
Yeah, well, so there you go.
So unless you come through with a dual diagnosis of autism, I have heard sometimes of people with significant dyslexia where they can't read at all, so their functional literacy skills, they don't have them, that they've been able to get some support. But I think there's only 2 cases I've heard of. Generally, no, we're not. The only funding we can access is job access, which is the funding we use to deliver support.
Yeah.
But we use it also for the one-on-one support. So we have a lot of people come through under the neurodivergent umbrella, but particularly dyslexia, that just need to have a peer, but also they just don't know what tools are available. But then you've got the barrier of, we have some awesome tools now, but, is IT going to allow it? Especially when you're working with clients in, high security jobs.
Yeah, I think it's probably a really fascinating one because my guess is that dyslexia is perceived as a learning disability. Consequently, they'd be going, well, that's the education system.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, it's broader than that. I look at my brother and I was talking to him a few weeks back and I said, how do you get by? He said, I can't read. He said, I listen to things. He said, I go to work. He said, I have headphones and I'm listening. He said, you want me to do something? He said, don't give me a piece of paper with written instructions. He said, you show me, you tell me, and I'm fine. And it's fascinating because, I've never noticed that in my brother. Now, admittedly, at my age, I don't remember much about our upbringing in that sense because, that was a long time ago, but I'd never noticed it. My brother said to me recently that his dyslexia, when he was younger, people just told him he was dumb because he couldn't read, not recognising that he actually had a disability. And I think that's probably one of those things where dyslexia falls between the gaps because all the education people go, well, it's our problem, but we don't understand it. We don't have the funding to deal with it. And then you have all the other people at the NDIS who are kind of probably going, well, that's an education problem. And I think, this is probably one of the things where it falls down is it's easy to say that's an education system problem, that's an NDIS problem, that's an employment problem. But the trouble is all those departments don't talk. They don't work together. I mean, we work in the education system, and it's just fascinating to see the disconnect. We don't have a cohesive system that supports individuals to grow, to learn, to be healthy, to work. You just got to find your way through a box, smash out of that one, start again, break into that one, and I can see why people give up.
Yeah, because I've been doing this for 8 years now plus. This must be, I think it's our 6th or 7th year of podcasts, and that's how we started, was sharing stories of lived experience. And it's hard. At Rethink Dyslexia, we are doing things differently. As a global leader in creating inclusive environments for adults with dyslexia, our commitment is to provide individuals with opportunities to live healthier, happier, and more connected lives. Through our range of tailored services, including coaching, learning and development programs, consultancy, and training, we are helping dyslexic individuals, businesses, and organisations to better understand and support their dyslexic employees. So if you're looking for insights, inspiration, and expert advice on dyslexia and how you can provide inclusive practices and environments, then head to rethinkdyslexia.com to find out more or book your free consultation today. It's hard to get the funding because we sit across multiple sectors of education, health, like the whole social determinants. There's not one area that I've found apart from job access that's given us any support.
See, I wonder what happens, if you think, they can claim it's an education problem, but what happens when you're 18?
That's right.
You're not in the education system, which I'm guessing is where most people probably pop up with the problems because you're a long time an adult as opposed to being a kid. And that's where the supports need to be, not just education, but they shouldn't be abandoned because someone's 18 or 21. It really, it probably needs to be a lot stronger. But my suspicion is that a lot of people go, well, they got this far, they'll be right. They'll work it out themselves, which is wrong.
And we see a lot of particularly women at the moment coming in late diagnosed. And you put a lot of strategies in. And yes, we work with some people that, from exec level, and we know dyslexics are everywhere. So that would be the assumption. Like if you could get into an exec role or a board role or you can do your PhD, then you're fine. And it just means we've had really good strategies. And when we talk to parents, we say you can't be there forever. You have to start teaching your young people the skills to survive. Because I had my mum who would proofread everything, but she'd drop everything. I'd have to send her an email or a report in the middle of the day to proofread for me. So the extra stress that we put on people, and it's like I'm quite autonomous now with AI because when my mum passed away, my auntie would do all that for me. But I don't need her help anymore as much. Like she'll check something if it's important, but generally I have AI tools now. So I'm lucky because I'm in an environment where I can use those tools and I know what they are. But lots of people don't, or they don't know how to access them, or they don't know what's around, and you are left to float.
Yeah, but there's also this presumption that everybody has access to technology, which is really a nonsense. Most people with disability that are coming from the poorer socioeconomic households don't have access to the technology that most people take for granted. Yes, they might have internet, but it's probably slow. They probably have a dodgy computer, but they probably have a great Game Boy, or Xbox or something like that. So this idea that technology is a great leveler is a bit of a nonsense. Yes, it provides better tools, no doubt, but what happens if you can't afford to access them?
Yeah.
You're digitally poor.
And that's another challenge, digital literacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when we started this conversation, we were going to talk about the umbrella effect. And I've seen the umbrella effect with the neurodivergence movement, which is creating a lot of conversations, a lot of positive conversations that, 5 years ago we would not have been having. I think, in the last couple of years it's been huge.
I think like everything where they create a term for a particular aspect of disability, in time there is a tendency to broaden who's under that umbrella in order to give it enough, volume, so that it carries more weight from an advocacy perspective. Is that a good thing? No, it's more emblematic of the fact that if you go back probably 30 years, one of the things that John Howard was famous for was that he managed to destroy a unified voice in the disability movement and career, and everybody went into silos, and that meant they had to compete. And that was part of a strategy to mean that he could reduce the mass into individual groups, and individual groups don't have as big a voice and don't have as much power. So it meant that we have this strange situation where, even though there are peak bodies that claim to represent all and every disability group out there, the reality is that there are so many groups competing for the spending that the government has a lot more control, and the whole idea of, umbrellas, honestly, if that happens, that's fine. But I don't think, in terms of umbrellas, I don't think you need to be expanding the definition of what you do or the group you represent in order to bring more people into your tent. I think there's a very real possibility that many of the people coming into that tent, particularly under the neurodiverse title, will be, they'll disappear into the large number when people will go, okay, neurodiverse, that's people with autism. But, the term today encompasses a broader spectrum of disability. Even intellectual disability is often in there. If you go back probably a couple of decades, what the primary diagnosis most people got of a disability, or significant number got, was an intellectual disability, and autism was their shadow disability or the secondary one. And it's my view that what's happened over the last 30 or so years is that's flipped. And now autism is the primary disability and intellectual disability is the secondary one. And I'm not going to go much further on that because I'll start to get weirdly political. But I just think this is what you tend to see, is that these things move around a little bit. And that's just simply a response to what's going on in the environment, generally the funding environments. I'll probably be proven wrong on that, but certainly that's my observation.
So how do you think we can support people that get swept up into the umbrella effect? Because we don't choose it. We are placed under it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? You don't get a choice, despite what you say. I think that, it's really important that various disabilities have champions, that people that are prepared to stand there and go, you know what, this is what the truth is. This is what I see every day. This is what I do every day. This is what it looks like. If you want to take it over there to make it part of your group, that's fine. But this is what the evidence says. This is what it is. And it's probably one of the challenges we've had with customised employment. Because we've literally come out of, the support from Harry Griffin and his group, Griffin Hamer's Associates, all those years ago, which they still support us technically, the Technical Alliance. The reality is that one of the things that Carrie's always said to me is that, part of my role is not just to advance the evidence base, but also protect the integrity of it. And I think that's what, that's probably more important in many ways, not simply about the evidence for what we do, but also protect the integrity of it. Otherwise you find a situation where everybody claims to do something and very few of them have been trained. I mean, it's the reason we've gone down the pathway of developing the cause of ACRE in the US, which is the accrediting body, and having the only accredited customised employment program in Australia, is because everybody says they do it. But you know what? Very few people are actually trained in it. So it's a bit of a, as Carrie said, sometimes you've just got to keep going out there reminding people that, that this is what it is. And that's, to take that position is not a favoured one for a lot of people who like to own things without actually having the knowledge. So it's an interesting one, and that's the journey you're probably on, my guess. But the good news is there are lots of people like us who are there to protect the integrity of things. So that's why we work with people like you.
I like how you frame that, because sometimes I get overwhelmed by the noise or the amount of people I see that are now doing neurodiversity training or ADHD training, and I get so overwhelmed. I think, how are we ever really going to make a difference when there's these multiple people? But I think it comes back to what you're saying. It's the integrity, and I feel our integrity lies in our research and creating that evidence base.
Do your research, keep your values, maintain your integrity, and don't deviate. The others will come and go, and eventually they'll get found out. But Stick to your...
What has kept you for all this time doing it? Because it's a hard area to work in. Like, it's really...
Oh, no question about it. I mean, there are people that are always trying to undermine what we do. I mean, you see that all over the world. The reality is that what you've got to do is, if you're values driven, then stick with it. I mean, what you discover in time, and I think Carrie's often said to me, one of the things he said to me years ago was, if you do things for the right reasons and trust that the right people will turn up, And I think that's always been something you've got to do. For some people, I'm a little bit brash, maybe not the word, but, a little bit too, shall we say, probably a little bit too country. But, at the end of the day, you can't take the country out of the boy. But I did have a minister say to me a couple of years ago that one of the reasons I like you is because you're not afraid to say the things that everybody else is afraid to say. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's fine. I said, more likely because everybody else wants money from the government. I mean, who doesn't? But, at the end of the day, if you're going to do something, you do it for the right reasons, and you stay true to the evidence base, and you stay true to your values. And, you won't make $1 million doing that, but you can go to bed every night going, I did the right thing. And that's what you've got to do.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's the people we help that you can't put a price on.
No, you can't.
That's priceless. I try to explain that to my husband, and he goes, okay.
Well, I had the same issue with my father probably 20-odd years ago when he said to me, he said, your brothers are really successful. They own all this stuff. And he said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm not measuring my life on how many things I own. I'm measuring it on how many people I help. My wife would probably say, well, it'd be good if you'd actually help us financially. But, yeah, I mean,
your wife and my husband should get together and have...
They should probably have coffee regularly to commiserate.
I have often asked him if he wanted me to set up a support group for partners of neurodivergent people.
Well, if you do, my wife will join.
What has been one of your key learnings over your journey of working in this space that listeners might find helpful, or me in particular, because I love these sessions because I feel like it's a little mini mentoring session from people?
I think one of the things I've learned over the years is there are a lot of people out there that are trying to do the right thing. There are a lot of people that are out there doing the right thing, but they're doing it silently. And sooner or later you come across them, and sooner or later they come into your orbit, and sooner or later your orbit gets bigger and bigger. And what you end up eventually is an orbit of people that you know firsthand, that you can pick up the phone and talk to. And most people would eventually, when they see who's in your orbit, they kind of go, how do you know these people? Well, I know them because we have shared values and paths. It's kind of, I think that's the way, it's just recognise that there are a lot of people quietly getting on with it. I mean, my father gave me a book when I was about 14 or 15 and having my going off the rails moment. It was called A Letter to Garcia. And that was 50-odd years ago. And it had a profound effect on how I do things. And it's worth buying. So much so that I lost the copy my father gave me, as you would, being a kid. Then I found another copy. And about 4 years ago, I found 100-and-something-year-old original copy in an antique bookstore. It was a 1900-something or other, I think, and I brought it. And it sits here. It's one of my prized possessions. It's actually in a sealed zip bag, so it can't be touched by the weather. It's something as simple as that. As simple as the statements that Carrie make about if you do it for the right reasons, trust the right people will be there. Just quietly do it. If you need to make a noise when you have to, push back when you have to, but just get on with it. Right? Because all the people making a noise out there that tell you can't do it, they're not doing it, and they never will do it. They're the shortcutters on the world. All right? Stick to your values, get the right people around you, do it for the right reasons, and just do it. I hear people say all the time that, we'd love to do these things, but, we need hundreds of thousands of dollars for this research and, we can't do it because the university needs $150,000 grant to do it. And I look at it and go, no, you don't. Just do it. It's time. That's all it takes, time. And we have 7 days in a week. Use them. I mean, if you've done a PhD, you know that you use your 24 hours in a day. You use your 7 days a week. I mean, up until recently, I mostly, and I still do, to be honest, I still don't go to bed much before 2 o'clock. And I'm usually up by 6:30, 7 o'clock. And I use my days. Sometimes not as fully as I'd like to, but you know what? You can use them. You can do things. That's what you got to do. I mean, that's me. It works for me. It might drive someone else nuts, probably my wife.
I think my PhD has zapped all the energy out of me because I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do my PhD before I'd go to work because I worked full time till near the end. And now I'm lucky to get up when my daughter surprises me. I'm like, what are you doing? It's early. And she's like, it's get up time. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah. I think I need a couple of years to recover.
My wife has a fluffy dog that stands there on the bed going, it's time. It's like, okay, fine.
Well, hopefully when my daughter's a bit older, I might have some of the energy back.
No, you'll be right. You'll get there.
Well, I feel like that's a really positive note, and I feel very positive having this conversation on a Friday afternoon because this sector can knock you about, and sometimes you end up working with some difficult cases and seeing where you can't help. And I think for me, sometimes I feel quite deflated when I've tried so hard, but we can't change the outcome. And we have that all the time.
Yes, but, it's also the recognition that one of the things I've learned in psych school was that you can't save everybody. And as harsh as that might sound, that's the reality of life.
But if you stick to your values, I like that saying, I need to write it down, and the people will come.
Absolutely.
I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm really grateful for your time, Peter, and learning more about your history of where you've come from and what the work you do, because it aligns so closely to what we do as well. And it's really nice to be able to talk to other organisations that are doing similar work to us. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to come and speak at your conference. So I'm really grateful for that. So thank you, and thank you for coming on the show.
Not a problem. Look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time.
Me too. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Have a great weekend.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.
Oh, yeah.